Okay, well, thank you all for coming today. Let's delve right into it. So the point I'd like to make in this lecture is that cooperatives are not rare because they're inherently inefficient, as is often believed, but rather because of essentially political factors. And indeed, I will argue that the idea of inherent inefficiency is inherently flawed. So I think this topic is important to give some perspective. You heard in Josteyn's talk last week that different economic activities have different potentials for growth and development, but organizational factors also matter as well, such as who owns the firm and how firms are managed. And just as it cannot be presumed that the technological status quo, as reflected in comparative advantage, is optimal, neither can it be presumed that the organizational status quo, as reflected in the predominance of capitalist firms, is optimal. You heard in Josteyn's talk that neoclassical economics tends to treat these technological factors that he spoke of as a sort of black box. And this is more or less true for organizational factors. The firm is generally treated as just a production function that transforms inputs into outputs. And this is convenient because it basically allows it to be sort of a placeholder in between markets in which consumers and producers maximize utility and profits. Now, starting with Ronald Coase's famous article in 1937 entitled "The Nature of the Firm," some following the neoclassical tradition have tried to open this organizational black box by extending the neoclassical framework to explain things like property rights, management systems, and so on. And I will refer to those theories as exchange-based theories of the firm, which are in contrast to a separate set of theories of the firm, which I refer to as production-based theories, which do not stem from this neoclassical tradition and which take production rather than exchange as the starting point. I think it's important that I make that distinction, although it does, I hope it doesn't become too confusing. In any case, I will argue that neither of these sets of theories can adequately grasp cooperatives, nor can they explain why they are relatively uncommon. And it's true that cooperatives are usually assumed, both in theories of the firm and by the public at large, to serve primarily a social role, as maybe reducing inequality, a source for ideologically motivated individuals, maybe a source of social justice, and so on. But what I'm focusing on in this lecture is really just rather strict economic criteria. But before I do that, I think it's worth clarifying exactly what a cooperative is, although perhaps my definition might only mystify it further. Basically, it's quite simple. A cooperative is a firm that is owned and controlled by its members. So then the question is, what are the members? Well, if in a conventional firm, ownership and control reside in parties outside of the production and consumption process, namely investors. Whereas in a cooperative, where ownership control reside in the members, those members are either producers or consumers. So if the members are workers or producers, then it's a worker or producer co-op. If they are consumers or other types of users, then it's a consumer or user co-op. So that's a very broad definition, but there's really no other way to do it, because in reality, cooperatives are so heterogeneous that it's hard to become more specific than that. And indeed, cooperatives vary widely in their legal structures throughout the world. And there are even hybrid worker-consumer cooperatives, and there are even hybrids between cooperatives and capitalist firms, where 50% of shares are owned by workers and 50% by other parties. And moreover, the legal structure of cooperatives differs between countries. So for instance, in most European countries, there are specific cooperative laws that pertaining to cooperatives, which allows a firm to register as a cooperative officially. In the UK, this is not the case. There are sort of a range of different legal forms that cooperatives will have to register under, such as just a limited company. There's an Industrial and Providential Society Act and a couple of others, and then after they register in these forms, then they adopt their own statutes and ordinances and so on. And this makes it rather difficult to pin down exactly what cooperatives are in the UK. But this point on the differing legal structures and the lack of a cooperative law in the UK leads me into the sort of meat of the discussion, into what I call the British paradox, which is that on the one hand, Britain has a very rich history of cooperatives, and indeed the modern consumer cooperative movement began here in Manchester, when a group of social reformers known as the Rochdale Pioneers responded to the harsh working conditions of the Industrial Revolution. And the co-op, as you see today in grocery stores, funeral care, and various other services, is today's legacy of the Rochdale movement. Not only that, but cooperatives in this country have long paid lip service to politicians, have long paid lip service to cooperatives, and that includes politicians from both of the main parties. So for conservatives, cooperatives are considered a useful means of self-help, reducing dependency on the state, increasing small property ownership, and so on. And in fact, there is a conservative cooperative movement. For labor, there are a progressive means of democratizing the economy, improving work life, elevating the position of labor vis-a-vis capital, and so on. And there's also a cooperative party associated with labor, although that link has recently been severed following the various scandals in the cooperative group. But in any case, for both parties, cooperatives are rather amenable to political aphorisms like community enterprise or capitalism with a human face, responsible business, and so on. So despite the rich history of cooperativism in this country and the nominal support from politicians, the cooperative sector in Britain is actually quite meager as compared to other European countries. So for instance, in 2011, Spain, with an economy of about half the size of the UK's, had 4 times as many cooperative businesses as the UK, with 22,000 versus the UK's 5,500. It had 20 times as many members, with 270 million versus the UK's 13 million. And similar findings like this would pertain if you compared to countries like France or Italy. Another interesting figure, and a slightly different comparison, take the percentage of cooperatives, the contribution of cooperatives to GDP. In the UK, it's about 2%. In Sweden, it's 13%. In Switzerland, 16%, and 21% in Finland. So this is the paradox. And there's another aspect to it, which is that although consumer cooperatives have actually been quite prolific in the UK, ever since the Rochdale Pioneers, and this is reflected in the fact that the co-op is still quite active and significant, producer cooperatives have never been as pervasive. And actually, this is interesting because the Rochdale Pioneers actually envisaged consumer cooperativism as just a means to finance producer cooperativism. However, the various producer co-ops they set up never took off. For instance, a textile factory was bought out by investors within just a few years. So And this lopsidedness between consumer and producer co-ops is reflected today of the 5,500 cooperative businesses in the UK. Only 1/10 of those, 550, are worker co-ops. Of the 12.8 million members, only 5,000, that's 1/2,000th, are members of worker co-ops. And of the total turnover of £33 billion, only £157 million, that's 1/200th, is due to worker co-ops. So a very small fraction. Contrast this to consumer co-ops, which have almost twice as many members as producer co-ops and 100 times the turnover of worker co-ops, making up half of the total turnover of cooperatives. And admittedly, as I said before, it's very hard to pin down exactly what is a worker co-op. So these statistics are rather vague, but they do seem to fluctuate at a constant proportion. So it implies that it is actually an underlying trend. So in any case, what accounts for this paradox, which is twofold, as I said. Firstly, that cooperatives are rare, despite a rich history and nominal support, and secondly, that consumer cooperatives tend to thrive relative to producer co-ops. There are a couple of explanations deriving from the theories of the firm that I talked about earlier, and both of these basically come to the conclusion that cooperatives are inherently inefficient, and that explains why they are rare. So according to exchange-based theories, cooperatives are inefficient because they fail to constrain what they refer to as opportunistic behavior. So basically, free riding, as I'm sure everyone here has learned about in their economics courses. And this can be in work, so just simply the case that workers, because they're not managed, by an external monitor, or because they don't, because of the structure of property rights and so on, they free ride on each other's work. And it could also be an investment that worker owners refuse to contribute their own resources to the firm. So if this is the case, then the prediction is that worker co-ops will only be confined to certain extreme cases, like for instance law partnerships, which are basically cooperatives. And exchange-based theories would say that makes sense because in a law partnership it's basically impossible to monitor a lawyer. I mean, he has so much sort of rarefied skill that it would be impossible to monitor him or to incentivize him using some kind of, it would be impossible to incentivize him if he was not the owner, that is, if it was not run as a cooperative. So I think if you're interested in these criticisms, there's a lot in the reading about it, but in general, they are on the whole misguided, I would argue, because there's no a priori reason why monitoring in cooperatives couldn't in fact be superior to monitoring in other forms of enterprise, considering that there would be less information asymmetry as workers are proximate to each other and share skills and experience with each other, and may even be able to monitor each other, all the while reducing the bureaucratic costs that accompany hierarchical management systems. And likewise, they may in fact entail superior incentives, as has been more or less confirmed empirically with the rise of employee stock ownership programs, especially in the United States. These show, although the results are mixed and contingent on various factors, in general, there's a pretty clear trend that by giving workers participation in ownership and governance, then productivity tends to increase. And perhaps most fundamentally, at least in my view, cooperatives may stimulate less self-centered motivation, thus avoiding the issue of opportunism altogether, or at least somewhat. So if these theories are not fully convincing, what about production-based theories? Well, according to these theories, advanced technologies require complex divisions of labor and hierarchical management systems. And these are presumably inconsistent with the egalitarian principles of cooperatives. So how could you have a situation in which all members are equal if some are paid more, some are higher skilled, some are even managing others? This would seem to be impossible. But in fact, most cooperatives can and usually do elect managers to oversee them, and even choose to perform, relatively mundane tasks. And why do they do this? Well, it's because as a cooperative member, you're both an owner and a worker. So yes, as a worker, you may endure unfavorable conditions, but you may reap the benefits of that as an owner. And precisely because of this dual role, in fact, I would argue that cooperatives may be more, not less, suited to implementing these supposedly alienating structures, because they have the potential to sort of attenuate their adverse effects. All right, I just lost my place. Give me a second. Page numbers are very helpful. Okay, so if cooperatives are not inherently inefficient, then the question still remains: why are they so rare? I would say the first point to make in attempting to answer this question is that the very idea of inherent efficiency or inherent inefficiency is inherently flawed. And what I mean by that is that efficiency cannot be theorized in some abstract model, but to use a word, but rather depends on the firm's interaction with the institutional environment. And what I mean by institutional environment is simply the things like legal structures, financial systems, educational systems, all of the institutions that firms rely on as they go about their operations. And indeed, there's plenty of literature to show that when the capitalist firm sort of came to prominence during the Industrial Revolution, that it was not the only possible trajectory, nor was it necessarily the most efficient option available. That alternative forms of governance could have been equally viable and perhaps even more efficient. However, cooperatives were, in a sense, muffled by an institutional bias coming from things like financial and legal constraints. So, for example, in one of the readings, the authors show that because of a lack of limited liability and a lack of redeemability of worker shares in the legal structure, that it was simply not possible to create cooperatives during that time. And this led to a sort of self-reinforcing process whereby the economy became dominated by capitalist firms, which then fed back into mainstream institutions of education, finance, and so on, which in turn favored capitalist firms all the more so. And it's not just the institutions themselves, but it's also the routinized behavior and the incentives associated with them. After all, most people, when starting a business, don't even think about forming a cooperative. And even if they did think about it, they would probably discard the option because they could make more money starting a traditional firm. And the same is true if you take managers. Cooperatives often find it difficult to find managers who know how to work in a co-op. But even if they can find those managers, the managers could make more money working in a conventional firm. So there's this sort of self-reinforcing process, which is often referred to as path dependency. So there's evidence that this is the case because cooperatives often spring up during crises. In fact, even in the US at the moment, there's quite a surge of cooperative forms following the financial crisis. And moreover, tend to thrive within groups of cooperatives that provide them with services like finance and management training and so on that they don't get from the mainstream environment, mainstream institutional environment. So where do consumer cooperatives come into play? Well, it may be plausible to think that consumer cooperatives don't face this bias to the same extent as producer co-ops, perhaps because they're a lot less capital intensive, require less specific skills and so on. So Beatrice Webb, who seminally documented the failures of cooperatives in the UK in the 1840s and 50s, concluded that although producer co-ops were not viable in the UK economy, that consumer co-ops, especially if federated, as in the modern co-op, could be successful. Now, although this trend continues today, as I mentioned earlier, as you've probably have seen in the news recently, even the co-op has suffered quite severely from a number of scandals and crises, not least being rescued by US hedge funds in the financial crisis. This only raises the question, though, of why these problems persist. Why, in particular, does the government continue to support the mainstream institutional environment, or is it just part of the process of path dependence? Well, other countries have actually contributed much more in terms of policy to cooperatives. So, for instance, in Spain, regional federations of cooperatives are federated at national and European levels, and they have a lot of say in policy making. So the legal framework and the policies that are devised by the various levels of government are take into account the representation of cooperative federations, which exercise quite a lot of power. So why is this not the case in the UK? And indeed many other countries? I submit that the answer is that cooperatives occupy a sort of no man's land, if you will, in between political parties and ideologies. So what exactly do I mean by that? Well, consider starting with the sort of liberal tradition. John Stuart Mill famously advocated an economy based on worker ownership. However, in general, liberal political philosophy has tended to focus on defending the free market. And the same can be said of conservative politicians. After all, large businesses owned by capitalists, to which cooperatives represent an existential threat, are the main political driving force of the Conservative Party. So consider, for instance, Thatcher's famous policies of stripping the economy down to sort of pure market forces. Well, there's really no such thing as pure market forces, as I've touched on before. All this does is ingrain the status quo of capitalist firms in the focus of this lecture, at least. So consider, for example, the decline of regional development banks. Although that would have harmed all small and medium-sized enterprises, it's plausible that it would have harmed cooperatives even more so because of the greater bias that they suffer and the modern mainstream institutional environment. And it's also plausible that consumer co-ops are less of a threat to big business and may find it easier to survive in these adverse institutional conditions. But then again, you could dispute that point by pointing to the wave of demutualization, that's a big word, demutualization of Britain's building societies starting in the 80s. So what about on the left? Well, many radicals have actually envisaged cooperatives as a means to transition towards socialism. However, in general, radical political philosophy has been more concerned with state control. And of course, this was this is kind of a schism in Marxist thought, but it remains the case that cooperatives are actually seen by many radicals as inimical to the welfare of workers. For instance, they may entail self-exploitation. As I mentioned earlier, they may consent to harsh working conditions. They may even prop up managerial elites, and they may dilute class consciousness, thus delaying the revolution of the working class. So from a Marxist perspective, cooperatives are double-edged. And perhaps most fundamentally, cooperatives represent an existential threat to unions. After all, if there's no capitalists, then there's no need for a union to advocate on behalf of workers. And of course, unions are a main political force of the Labour Party. So consider, for instance, in the 1970s, the industrial common ownership movement associated with the Labour Party. In 1976, this movement was afforded £100,000 of seed funding, and along with $50,000 for its Scottish counterpart, to promote worker ownership. And it successfully promoted 2,000 workers' co-ops, although several of them failed, or a large number, I should say. However, mainstream dominant figures like Arthur Scargill, leader of the National Union of Mine Workers, advocated collective bargaining rather than workers' control of firms as a recipe for collaboration designed to frustrate the real aspirations of the working class, in his words. So in the same year as Parliament afforded the grant to the industrial common ownership movement, it also issued the Bullock Report, which recommended creating company boards composed of equal numbers of worker directors and shareholders representatives. And you can see the desire for unions to maintain their role in capital labor relations bleeding through there. And it's quite clear that consumer co-ops don't face that same tension, because in a consumer co-op, the workers are just regular employees. They can still be unionized, they can still go on strike. They are not co-owners of the firm as in a workers' co-op. That said, of course, as I said earlier, labor has recently severed its ties with the co-op in response to a series of scandals. So in short, to sum up this section, I would say that there's an ideological gap between left and right-wing ideologies and policies into which cooperatives slip. So one way of putting this, and I owe this to my supervisor, is that cooperatives are everyone's half-brother, greatly cherished but never embraced. The cousin that you see at Christmas parties but never again. And I think it's interesting to note that this gap is perhaps filled in other countries that have syndicalist and other traditions, for instance, Catholic traditions, which seem to fill this void and therefore create more support for policies favorable to co-ops. Consider, for example, in Spain that under the Franco government, cooperativism practically disappeared, except under very strict, vertically controlled syndicates. But after his death, with Spain's democratization and the proliferation of political expression, a plethora of institutions immediately emerged to support co-ops. And it's, as I said before, it's been quite a significant, co-ops have been a significant player in Spain ever since then. Excuse me. So, to conclude, I think cooperatives can be economically superior to conventional firms, given the appropriate institutional environment. But in the end, it comes down to policies and politics. And I think there's a broader application to neoclassical or mainstream economics here, which is that economic explanations have to be grounded in political, social, historical realities, rather than simply theorized abstractly. So is there hope for cooperatives, if I may venture the question? Well, I like to think so. Yes, it's true that cooperatives fall between the cracks of mainstream politics, but by the same token, perhaps they're one of the few things that parties can agree on, especially during times when people are looking for alternatives, to use an overused adage. As the expert on cooperative firms, Henry Hansford, said, and this was in 1996, there is considerable enthusiasm today for promoting forms of ownership other than the conventional investor-owned corporation. Much of this interest centers on labor-managed enterprise and reflects an unusual convergence of economic thought from opposite ends of the political spectrum. On the left, recent years have brought the final collapse of state socialism as a persuasive economic ideal throughout the world. In the resulting ideological void, workplace democracy has emerged as the principal institutional reform that commands widespread support among critics of capitalism. Reformers on the right, in turn, have become increasingly discouraged with the efficiency of traditional forms of labor management relations. As an alternative, many have turned to employee ownership, hoping that it will improve productivity and increase worker identification with the interests of capital. So, there may be some conflicting interests in there, but there's perhaps some common ground nevertheless. Unfortunately, there is a flip side of this commonality, which is that the current conservative-led government has, I would say, rather sneakily been using cooperatives, or at least mutual types of business, as a means for essentially privatizing public services. Sort of through the back door, if you will, such as mutualizing NHS hospitals, public schools, here you don't call them public schools, state schools, but I guess that's a subject for another lecture. So, thank you very much. I think there are further readings on the website, and if you're interested in writing an essay, which I'm sure you will be, then you can write on the topic of how might cooperative firms help to address the problems faced by less developed economies. And if you want the title, you can come and see me afterwards. Well, thank you very much.
We have 10 minutes for questions, so please.
Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I have two very different questions, one more on the theoretical side and one on the policies and institutions. On theory, I just wanted to make sure whether you meant that both exchange and production-based theory broadly, or everyone on those mainstream areas, are of the idea that these are inherently inefficient, because I don't really see that. You talked about the heterogeneity among cooperatives, and I think in the end it boils down to how the detailed mechanism design balances social objectives and profit maximization, for instance. And you've got all sorts of cooperatives that you look at them and they seem like any other firm. Mm-hmm. So I don't really see the theories, I don't see that they imply that they have to be inherently or relatively inefficient. even if you think, it's interesting, you think of the most basic neoclassical exchange and equilibrium model, you have producer-consumers, owners of capital, so there's no reason why it should be inconsistent with cooperatives. It's like they are there in the core of neoclassical economics.
Right.
So in some, it's whether everyone says they are relatively inefficient or there is a big debate and then people is divided. And on the applied side, I would like to ask you if you could talk a bit more in terms of concrete political conditions, not political conditions, but institutional conditions and policies that were implemented, for instance, in Spain after Franco, or how much you think the current state of affairs depends on policies and which part of it, the current state of things is explained by, well, not random, but by crisis and the path dependency after crisis. Mm-hmm. How would you share things? How much is path dependency of after crisis periods and how much is the initial policies and how these initial policies were different in concrete?
Okay. Yeah, so quite a few questions in there. Hopefully I can remember all of them, but yeah, basically for the sake of the lecture, I had to simplify quite dramatically on the theoretical side of it. I mean, I could have spent more than a whole lecture just on that. And so it was quite a simplification. Now, what I've referred to as contract-based theories, it may have been inaccurate of me to use the word inherent, because they don't say that cooperatives are sort of efficient under all circumstances, but as I said, they will almost always be inefficient. And they actually say this explicitly. So they say that, as I said, things like law partnerships, because the workers have such high amounts of sort of specific skills that somebody else would not be able to monitor their work. It doesn't make sense to manage it as a conventional firm. So that's made quite clear in exchange-based theories that besides those rare circumstances, in most cases, it will be efficient, it will be optimal for capital to hire labor. Now, there's a whole variety of different exchange-based theories, which I think would probably be inappropriate to sort of discuss in detail here. And some of them don't necessarily make any predictions at all about this, but many of them do. Now, on the production-based theories don't touch on the topic as much. They don't, because they're not as committed to sort of comparative statics, which is really a trait of neoclassical economics. Then they don't really bother making, saying which type of firm is more efficient. What I've done really is say what are the things that they say are important, and then extend that, namely divisions of labor, managerial hierarchies, and so on, and then extended that to cooperatives. So ask the question of are those consistent with cooperative principles? So I think that's the theoretical side of it. The second part of the question was some more sort of concrete policies. One thing, I think the most important thing that is one that I already mentioned, which is basically that cooperatives in Spain, worker co-ops, are federated at a regional level. So each autonomous community has a federation of worker co-ops, and these federations not only supply them, provide them with services like financial services, credit, and so on, and managerial services, technical services, legal services, and so on. But they also represent their member co-ops at national level and European level in policymaking institutions. So the co-ops are better represented. Now, of course, you could say that there's sort of a chicken and egg problem, because, like, if you just create a federation when there aren't any co-ops, then what do you get then? And that's a really good question. I think that's part of the problem of why, perhaps that is part of the problem of why, despite this, the commonality of interest that everyone seems to have in creating these co-ops, why they don't seem to get off the ground because there's, what they call in economics and other disciplines, threshold effects, various other terms for it. Until you reach that critical number of co-ops in the economy, how then it may be still, co-ops may still be inefficient until you reach that threshold, even with all those services and so on. So, and I think, it's also worth noting that even in Spain, which has such a rich history of co-ops, as was pointed out to me earlier, even countries like that, co-ops are still not the leading form of organization relative to other forms. So, that still raises a host of questions of even with all those favorable policies, co-ops are still, not predominant, then what does that imply? One other concrete policy that I think has been pointed to as being really effective is, for instance, in Spain, they allow unemployed people to capitalize their unemployment benefits. So rather than paying them X amount per month, they'll just say, here's a lump sum. Like, if you can find a job in a cooperative, and remember, to enter a cooperative, you normally have to pay a sort of entry fee, which is deposited into your account. Instead of paying an unemployed person sort of per monthly basis, they'll just pay you a lump sum, which you can use to buy your way into a cooperative or to create your own cooperative. And there's been some adverse effects of that. For instance, you get a lot of these like micro cooperatives that are not actually feasible, economically viable, just because the unemployed person had no other option. But nevertheless, it has been effective in creating jobs and so on. No, that's okay. The question, I was just finished answering anyway, so perfect timing. So there's some food for thought anyway.
Second question, please. Yeah, so thanks. I thought it was very super interesting topic. So I think you brought to some arguments to question the criticisms of production co-ops with regard to productivity. So I think in addition to that, you might also want to question some of the terms of the debate. So it seems that this focus on productivity also quite favors a capitalist firm. So it might be that a capitalist firm is much better at monitoring workers. Say, I think only in a capitalist firm you might be able to force people to clean a toilet in under 2 minutes. But there are all these other aspects of the sort of things you produce, how you produce them, and labor conditions which may come out in favor of the co-op.
Yeah, right. So what you're essentially saying is that in a co-op, workers, members may be able to have a more efficient, decide a more efficient trade-off between the economic and social concerns.
Yeah.
And so like kind of a welfarist perspective.
Exactly. So if you formulate efficiency only in terms of this narrow notion of productivity, favor capitalism. Yeah?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely points in there. A good point, and it goes back to the exchange-based theories sometimes say this, that cooperatives could be efficient because they allow workers to choose their work-life balance and use work as a means of not socializing, but as kind of intrinsically good rather than just a means to an income. And so if you were to take even a strict welfare maximization calculus, if you took those concerns into account, cooperatives may in fact come out ahead. And although that's true, I kind of wanted to get around that because I think that can tend to contribute to the perception of cooperatives as inefficient from strict economic point of view. And most people, some people would see it as kind of utopian or like not viable in a competitive economy for those type of firms to make up a large proportion, of production.
Yeah, so that's basically the problem, right? You need a certain amount of competitiveness in a market economy there. You might want to emphasize productivity, but so that depends a bit on the sort of policy debate you're engaged in and how
That's
topic
true.
you want to get.
That's true, and many have advocated cooperatives as, for instance, maybe a means to transitioning to so-called zero growth economy, or a more, an economy with less working hours and things like that. So that's definitely a good point, yeah.
If I can follow up on his, I'm not sure you can get away from that distinction really, because you were implicitly saying that cooperatives are relatively inefficient up to a threshold when you talk about this scope economies, to put it in a way. When you said, for instance, they thrive when they have an environment of supporting inputs coming from other co-ops, or having co-ops providing financial services. So before getting to that threshold, you were implicitly saying that they are relatively inefficient and they need this protected environment to, if they don't have that, they won't make it in the capitalist economy. So behind that point, or before getting to that point, you have this welfarist approach where you can still say they are better because they contribute to these other objectives. But when you get to a point where they get to be the political players they can be in Spain, maybe they even things out, or I don't know, they can be absolutely efficient or comparable to the others. But before that economic of scope things, they are not. At least that's what you said. That's something.
I don't know, but I think you're maybe confusing two different things. Are you saying that, this is going to sound complicated, but are you saying that I'm saying that cooperatives are, if they were to reach some threshold, then the sort of trade-offs between economic and social concerns would be eliminated? I don't think that's what I was saying. That those kind of trade-offs will always apply. True, they may be more severe, and certainly like research into a lot of cooperatives, for instance in the US, have shown that workers choose to work harder or to receive less pay and so on, just because they intrinsically like the idea of working in a co-op and managing their own job and so on. But I don't know that once you do reach that threshold, then those trade-offs would go away. I think that those two things are only loosely related.
Yeah, I was thinking more of the before that, where you said that they depend or they thrive when they have an environment with more cooperatives around. Mm-hmm. Or as it happens in Spain, where you have cooperatives in different sectors, and they can support each other. In some way, I thought you were implicitly saying that they are relatively inefficient. If you put a co-op on their own in an economy without co-ops, they are less likely to succeed and they're likely to die.
Yeah, from a purely economic standpoint, though.
Right. So there you're saying they're relatively inefficient.
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I have time
Yeah.
for.
Louis?
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for talking. I was just wondering, is there a lot of any empirical evidence to show that they can be as efficient to counter this misconception within co-ops?
Is there any evidence that co-ops can be efficient?
Yeah, equally as efficient.
Oh, yeah. There's plenty of evidence, and of course, the most famous example that everyone always points to is Mondragon, which is a massive cooperative group in the Basque Country in Spain. There's also multinational, and it really is. They've compared it to similar capitalist firms, and time again, it's come out ahead in terms of virtually any indicator you could think of. And there's many other similar studies, so yeah, there definitely is. But again, they're, as in social sciences, as is always the case in social science, these sort of experimental research where you try to create a controlled experiment in society, they're always going to have their flaws. you know, this is just simply the difference between social science and natural science, I think. But
Okay, I think we have to finish, but I'm sure Spencer is willing to answer your questions after, just for the purposes of being on time. So thank you for coming today. I think one of the recurrent streams or kind of topics of the Paper Zero's lecture is that what also Spencer emphasized, that it doesn't really make sense to consider different concepts with which we operate, such as firm, outside their historical and social context. And next week, Thorsten will be talking about labor market. So he will provide an alternative conceptualization of what labor market is to the neoclassical one, coming from the discipline of sociology, and showing how labor market was actually constructed and what is its existing position within the current system.
And if I'm not mistaken, we'll have a special focus on trade unions.
Yes, on trade unions. And also Spencer told what his essay question was, and next week we will bring a sheet for essay questions for each of the specific lectures, and we will also upload them on the website.
Good. Well, thank you, Spencer, again.